Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, J.P. Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 57, Svyatoslav III. At Andrei Bogolyubsky's death, the genealogically senior candidates to succeed him were his two brothers, Mikhailko and Vsevolod. Then came Mstislav and Yaropolk, the sons of his eldest brother Rostislav. All of them were in Chernihiv after Yaroslav Izyaslavich had thrown them out of the Kyiv lands. Svyatoslav of Chernihiv therefore decided that he should help smooth the process by persuading them to pledge loyalty to one another and to acknowledge Mikhailko as the senior among them, thereby following the traditional lateral succession scheme. The problem, of course, was that they were in Chernihiv, while the people of Suzdalia had no wish to remain in a vulnerable knyazless position, while some people elsewhere discussed who would take charge. They decided to take their own steps to resolve the succession. The townspeople of Rostov, Suzdal, and Pereyaslav-Zalesky sent representatives to Vladimir on the Klyazma to take part in the selection process. Yuri Andreevich, still in Novgorod, was rejected, as were Andrei's brothers. Their choice fell on the grandsons, Mstislav and Yaropolk, and they asked their brother-in-law, Gleb Rostislavich, Knyaz of Ryazan, to assist them in bringing their succession to pass. Thus, the citizens of Suzdalia rejected Yuri Dolgoruki's instructions that Andrei should be followed by his brothers, the same old system that Yaroslav the Wise had established and Dolgoruki had supported in Kyiv. All four contenders, the two brothers and the two grandsons, made their way to Suzdalia, and the people of Rostov invited Yaropolk Rostislavich to be their knyaz. Mikhailko occupied Vladimir, but Yaropolk and Mstislav brought an army gathered from Rostov, Pereyaslav-Zalesky, Ryazan, and Murom, and laid siege to the city. After 7 weeks, Vladimir was on the edge of starvation, and the townspeople asked Mikhailko to leave, which he did, flying back to Chernihiv to seek support from Svyatoslav. Yaropolk then assumed his place as Knyaz of Vladimir, while Mstislav took Rostov. Svyatoslav had other problems to deal with. The death of Andrei had also removed his main ally and backer, which meant that rivals saw the opportunity to challenge him. His cousin, Oleg Svyatoslavich, appealed to the Rostislavichi of Smolensk to join him in a war against Svyatoslav. Although they had also been Andrei's allies, they were quite happy to punish Svyatoslav for his interference in Kyiv. Oleg, with his brothers and the Rostislavichi, attacked Svyatoslav's towns. They plundered his land, but were unable to take any of the towns. In response, Svyatoslav burned Novgorod-Siversky and slaughtered Oleg's troops. The Rostislavichi had a better time of it in Kyiv. Yaroslav Izyaslavich voluntarily surrendered the city and returned to Lutsk, and Roman returned to the throne. Meanwhile, back in Suzdalia, the people were regretting their choices. The young knyazes were dominated by greedy advisors, and they were imposing a heavy burden on the people. Soon they turned to Mikhailko, asking him to return as their knyaz. He set off with Vsevolod and the troops supplied by Svyatoslav, who were joined by the Vladimir militia when they got to Moscow. According to the chronicler, Mikhailko was seriously ill and had to direct the battle from a stretcher, but he still managed to defeat his nephews. Mstislav fled to Novgorod and Yaropolk to Ryazan. Mikhailko entered Vladimir on the Klezmer and sat on the throne. In a reversal of their father's time, it was now the ruler of Susdalia who was put on the throne by another knyaz, and Mikhailko and Vsevolod were now in Svyatoslav's debt. While Svyatoslav was enjoying a run of success, the Rostislavichi were not. In May 1176, the Polovtsi made the usual raids to accompany a change of power in Kyiv. Roman ordered Rurik and his sons, also Yaropolk and Mstislav, sorry they have the same names as their cousins, to deal with them. According to the chronicler, David Rostislavich had some kind of falling out with his brothers, so he did not initially turn up for the campaign. When he changed his mind, he arrived too late to stop the Polovtsi, thrashing the Rostislavichi. Svyatoslav took this as his opportunity. He asserted that David's failure to join the campaign was a breach of oath that meant he should be stripped of his domain. Roman disagreed, and so Svyatoslav claimed that Roman was in breach of the agreement among the knyazes, and he attacked Kyiv. Svyatoslav's army included the usual Olgovichi contingents, and also the Chornyklobuki and the Kyivans. This is rather strange given that the Chornyklobuki and the Kievan militia not supporting Svyatoslav Knyaz was one of the main reasons why the previous campaign failed, but the chroniclers do not tell us why they have decided to change sides. Mstislav Vladimirovich, son of Vladimir Mstislavich of Dorogobush, who was Svyatoslav's son-in-law as well as a Mstislavich, joined him from Volhynia. Svyatoslav gave him the task of breaking his alliance with the Rostislavichi and expelling Yaropolk Romanovich from Trepov. Svyatoslav crossed the Dnieper to be met by Kyivans, who told him that Roman had fled the city to Belgorod. So on the 22nd of July, Svyatoslav occupied Kyiv, briefly because Roman's brother Mstislav soon turned up with reinforcements and forced Svyatoslav to withdraw to Chernihiv. While he withdrew, he sent word to the Polovtsi and asked them to attack his rivals, which they did, sacking Torchesk and carrying off captives. This was too much for the Rostislavichi, and they surrendered Kyiv to Svyatoslav under the already traditional formulation of doing it to prevent further killing of the Christians of Rus. The Rostislavichi may have had other considerations. A month earlier, Mikhailko Yurievich had died in Vladimir on the Klezmer and had been buried alongside his brother in the Church of the Mother of God. The citizens of Vladimir acclaimed his younger brother, the last surviving son of Yuri, as the new knyaz, Vsevolod of Vladimir. This was Vsevolod Balshoy Gnezdo, or Big Nest, who already turned up in our episodes on the Bulgars. He acquired the name thanks to his impressive number of children. Historians are still arguing over how many children he had, somewhere between 12 and 18. He had 2 wives, but there are no recorded children for the second one. His first wife actually appears in the chronicle from time to time. Her name was Maria, and she is usually regarded as being Ossetian, based on her father's name being given as Shvan, not a Slavic name, and the connections existing between Susdalia and the Caucasus. Andrei Bogolyubsky's son Yuri, who had briefly been Knyaz of Novgorod, moved to the Caucasus after he was expelled and joined the political opposition to the Queen, Tamar I. Yuri managed to arrange a marriage to Tamar and began an aggressive policy of expansion, including campaigning against the Turkic Sultanate of Rum. Unfortunately, he was also aggressive to Tamar, which resulted in the marriage being annulled and Yuri exiled to Constantinople. However, there is no actual proof for the Ossetian theory. Vsevolod's second wife is identified as the daughter of the Knyaz of Vitebsk. Although we know so little about these two marriages, we can see that they continue the trend of Rus knyazes detaching from their previous familial relations with Europe. It's also interesting how inconsistent we are in rendering the nicknames of rulers in English. Yuri Dolgoruki doesn't get called Yuri Longarm unless we're providing the meaning of his name, but with Bolshoi Gniezdo, this convention is reversed. We'll see the same thing with other rulers later on. Vsevolod was challenged shortly after by his nephew, Mstislav Rostislavich, the Knyaz of Rostov. According to the chroniclers, Vsevolod was conciliatory, proposing to his nephew that he rule in Vladimir, Mstislav in Rostov, and they let the people of Suzdal decide which of them to follow. But Mstislav was set on sole rule. Unfortunately for him, he was not able to back up his claim. When it came to battle, Vsevolod won and Mstislav fled to Novgorod, where he had previously been Knyaz. The people of Novgorod refused him sanctuary because he had given them up for Rostov, so he carried on running to his brother-in-law Gleb in Ryazan. This overturned the situation in Susdalia. Where Mikhalko had been beholden to Svyatoslav for installing him, Vsevolod had been acclaimed in Vladimir in his own right, and had now established himself as the ruler of a unified Susdalia, making himself the strongest single knyaz in Rus, just as his father had been. And while he did not owe his throne to Svyatoslav, he had spent time sheltering with Svyatoslav in his youth, and the pair were friends and allies. The re-established alliance of Susdalia and the Olgovichi was once again the most powerful military force in Rus, and would certainly have given the Rostislavichi cause to consider whether now was the right time to press their claims. Svyatoslav further removed any reason to fight with major concessions to the Rostislavichi. He named the Rostislavichi as his successors, and they agreed not to challenge his rule in Kyiv. And for the first time they agreed to split the Kievan lands, with the Rostislavichi remaining as the knyazes of Belgorod and Uzhgorod, rather than Svyatoslav appointing his own men. While Kyiv was settled for the time being, Vsevolod Bignest was not ready to rest, with Mstislav in exile with his brother Yaropolk together with Gleb Rostislavich in Ryazan, and wanted to eliminate his rivals. He marched on Ryazan with the troops of Rostov and Suzdal, supported by contingents from Kyiv and Pereyaslavl. He didn't get too far, as when he reached Kolomna, he heard that Gleb had gone around him and was raiding Vladimir with Pavlovsky allies. Vsevolod hurried back, caught up with the raiders on 7th of March 1177, and destroyed them, capturing Gleb, his son Roman, and Mstislav Rostislavich. He carried them into Vladimir, where the townspeople demanded that they be blinded in retribution for the desecration of churches. Vsevolod rejected the demand, but did have them thrown in a pit. Then he demanded Ryazan hand over Yaropolk and threw him in the pit too. Mstislav Rostislavich appealed to Svyatoslav, who, as the ruler of Kyiv, was supposed to act as mediator in disputes among the knyazes, something we have not seen a lot of, and Svyatoslav accepted his appeal. He sent 2 prelates to Vsevolod with the proposal that, rather than releasing Gleb to return to Ryazan, Vsevolod send them to Svyatoslav in Kyiv, and Svyatoslav would grant him a new domain. Gleb refused the deal and died in the pit in June. His son Roman pledged allegiance to Vsevolod and was allowed to return to Ryazan. The townspeople continued to demand that the brothers Mstislav and Yaropolk be blinded. Perhaps they saw their part in attacking Vladimir as treachery and therefore saw them as more deserving of punishment than Gleb and Roman, who were from Ryazan. Whatever the case, Vsevolod eventually agreed. The brothers were blinded and expelled from Susdalia. At least that's what the chroniclers say. The chroniclers also say that they travelled to Smolensk, where their blindness was miraculously healed at the Church of St. Gleb, so I'll leave you to decide for yourselves whether there was any actual blinding. After their miraculous recovery, the brothers proceeded to Novgorod, where Mstislav was acclaimed as knyaz and Yaropolk took over Torzhok. This arrangement was short-lived, as Mstislav died in April 1178, and so Yaropolk replaced him in Novgorod. This results in a replay of the situation we already saw under Bogolyubsky. Vsevolod objects to the appointment of Yaropolk and demands that Novgorod acknowledge him as its overlord. Novgorod rejects him. Vsevolod pillages the lands of Novgorod and sacks Voloklamsky as punishment. Novgorod appeals to Roman Rostislavich of Smolensk to come and take over instead. We might see this as another step in Novgorod distancing itself from Kyiv, as they did not ask Svyatoslav for protection. Thwarted for now in Novgorod, Vsevolod was reinforcing his alliance with Svyatoslav. He invited Svyatoslav's son, Vladimir, to visit Susdalia and married him to Mikhalko's daughter, his niece. The following year, in 1179, Vsevolod's nephew, Vladimir Glebovich, knyaz of Pereyaslavl, married Svyatoslav's niece, the daughter of Yaroslav of Chernihiv. In the same year, Svyatoslav's mother Maria died and was buried in Kyiv. She was buried in a less significant church, St. Cyril's, but this was still the first time that Kyiv had allowed any Olgovich to be buried in the city. It was another sign that Svyatoslav had earned their acceptance. And so he ruled peaceably in the city and everyone was content. What am I saying? This is Rus. Of course he didn't. Roman Rostislavich returned to Smolensk the following year, and the people of Novgorod asked his brother Mstislav to take over. Unfortunately, he died 6 months later of unknown causes, which left them with a new choice. This time, instead of another Rostislavich, or instead of asking Big Nest for a new knyaz, they did turn to Svyatoslav. He sent his son Vladimir, who, as a relative of Vsevolod by marriage, should have been acceptable to Susdalia as well. At least, that's probably what Svyatoslav was thinking. However, displacing the Rostislavichi was sure to cause some disgruntlement, and Vsevolod Bignest was unlikely to look favourably on Kyiv restoring its influence over Novgorod. It seems that 3 years in, Svyatoslav was feeling very comfortable in Kyiv, and getting the idea that he was the most important knyaz, and he could start interfering with other people's domains. It started in Ryazan. Before his death, Gleb Rostislavich had given each of his 6 sons a patrimonial domain, which meant that the Ryazan lands were no longer a unified holding. When Vsevolod Bignest released Roman to return home, Roman was unhappy with his small inheritance and set out to recover territory from his brothers. Vsevolod did not like this because a fragmented neighbour was less of a threat and easy to dominate, so he sent forces to support Roman's brothers. Svyatoslav, on the other hand, saw a beholden Roman at the head of a unified Ryazan as a solid potential ally, and any checks on Susdalian expansionism would be an added bonus. So he sent his son Gleb with troops to help Roman. But Vsevolod won the campaign, forced Roman to swear allegiance to him, and put Gleb in chains. Svyatoslav took the news of this about as well as you would expect, but he was cautious about retaliating against Vsevolod. Instead, he targeted the Rostislavichi, accusing them of obstructing his rule. The charges are a bit vague, but given that he'd taken Kyiv and Novgorod off them, perfectly plausible. The plan, according to the chroniclers, was as follows. Svyatoslav would expel David and Rurik Rostislavichi from their towns in the Kievan lands that they had been allowed to keep, and then, with his position strengthened, he would punish Vsevolod. He heard that David was out hunting, and he tried to take him captive. He failed, but the word was out. The Rostislavichi took it as a declaration of war. Svyatoslav suddenly felt vulnerable, and he withdrew to Chernihiv. As soon as Rurik heard that Svyatoslav had left the city, he marched on Kyiv himself, and sat on the throne of his father and grandfather. He immediately sent word to his Western Rus allies and dispatched David to Roman in Smolensk. But before he could get there, word came that Roman was dead, and David returned to Kyiv, where Rurik stepped aside and the people acclaimed David as knyaz. Rurik remained the military commander of the Rostislavichi, with support from Yaroslav Osmomysil and the Iziaslavichi of Lutsk. So now Svyatoslav left Kyiv to the Rostislavichi and turned his attention to revenge on Vsevolod. In early 1181 he gathered the Olgovichi, Polovtsi, Vladimir with the Novgorod militia, and Yaropolk Rostislavich, who was still harbouring bad blood against Vsevolod despite being miraculously healed of his blindness, and had ambitions to rule Susdalia himself. Roman of Ryazan, the cause of the war, held to his oath of allegiance and took Vsevolod's side. According to the chronicles, Vsevolod wished to avoid shedding Christian blood, and avoided engaging Svyatoslav in an all-out battle, leaving him with nothing to do but pillage as he chased around the countryside, looking increasingly foolish. When the spring thaws turned the terrain to mud, Svyatoslav was forced to withdraw in disgrace, travelling to Novgorod with Vladimir and leaving Gleb in captivity. The people of Novgorod made Svyatoslav their knyaz, which the chronicles suggest was intended to be a temporary measure before he retook Kyiv and returned the city to Vladimir. From Novgorod, Svyatoslav turned his attention once again to the Rostislavichi. He ordered his brother Yaroslav in Chernihiv to attack Drutsk in the Polotsk lands, and then took the Novgorod militia to join them. The Novgorodians reappointed Vladimir as knyaz. David Rostislavich brought his army to Drutsk to assist the defenders, but Svyatoslav defeated him and burned Drutsk. Then he rode for Kyiv. When Rurik heard that Svyatoslav was coming and his Polovtsi allies were waiting for him, he withdrew to Belgorod. So, once again, Svyatoslav occupied Kyiv. But Rurik's withdrawal was purely tactical. He also sent troops and the Chorny Klobuki to attack the Polovtsi, who were on the other side of the Dnieper. Rurik's men took the Polovtsi by surprise and completely routed them. Svyatoslav's military advantage evaporated, and the maneuver put Rurik in a position to dictate peace terms. He allowed Svyatoslav seniority and control of Kyiv, but he took all of the rest of the Kyiv lands for himself as co-ruler, based in Belgorod, and with the right to appoint the rulers of all the other Kievan towns. The two would share responsibility for defense against the Polovtsi, and they agreed not to form separate political alliances. Politically and militarily, Svyatoslav was reduced to rather a figurehead, but he did retain ecclesiastical authority and had the right to approve the appointment of bishops, which was an important element of being recognized as the senior knyaz. According to the chroniclers, Rurik agreed to the deal because he did not wish to shed Christian blood, something the knyazes did so much of that the chroniclers had stock phrases to describe it happening. What was more likely the reason was that the conflict had made it clear to both of them that neither enjoyed the kind of military advantage that would enable them to obtain an outright victory. Svyatoslav had the undoubted genealogical seniority. He was from a senior branch, from a preceding generation, and he was personally older than Rurik. This undermined the legitimacy of any challenge by Rurik. For Rurik, the outcome of Svyatoslav sharing rule and designating him as the successor was therefore an almost ideal outcome. It left him with military credibility and legitimacy, as well as practical authority over the Kyiv lands in the meantime. And unlike the situation where Andrei Bogolyubsky had been controlling the ruler of Kyiv, it did not reduce the prestige of the capital. Svyatoslav also seems to have thought it was a good idea. After his near disasters of the last couple of years, he responded to the peace with the Rostislavichi by seeking reconciliation with Vsevolod Bignest as well. Svyatoslav and Rurik sent a joint appeal for the release of Gleb to Vsevolod, who agreed on condition that Svyatoslav withdraw his agents from Novgorod. Shortly after, the people of Novgorod asked Vladimir to return to his father. Despite the limited success of the previous round, there were some new marriages between the families to secure the peace. Rurik's daughter married Gleb. Vsevolod sent his wife's sister, named for once Yasenia, to marry Svyatoslav's other son, Mstislav. On the basis of this rapprochement, Vsevolod asked Svyatoslav for assistance against the Bulgars, and Svyatoslav sent Vladimir with troops. This was the successful campaign against the city of Bulgar on the Volga that we heard about a couple of episodes back. In the traditional Russian narrative, this became a great victory, laying the foundations for Rus' dominance of the Volga trade. But you'll recall that by the end of Big Nest's reign, the Bulgars had extended their territory at the expense of the Rus, were still fully in charge of the Volga, and were dominating the neighbouring Finno-Ugrian peoples. So the chroniclers are rather getting ahead of themselves. Meanwhile, in the south, the Polovtsi were once again testing the Rus. A Khan called Konchak had gathered the warriors of the Donets tribes, and in February 1184 they pillaged the Pereyaslavl lands. Svyatoslav, who, as the Knyaz of Kyiv, still retained the supreme command when organizing the common defense of Rus, summoned Rurik and his brother Yaroslav, but Yaroslav persuaded them to delay action until the summer. Svyatoslav dispatched some Olgovichi troops to chase the raiders, and Rurik sent some of his to Pereyaslavl to shore up the defences, and they set aside the main campaign. In the summer, Svyatoslav summoned his sons, Yaroslav Osmomysil, Vladimir Glebovich of Pereyaslavl, and other minor knyazes for the campaign. They travelled down the Dnieper and found the Polovtsi by the Erel River at the end of July. The Rus won a major victory, capturing the Polovtsi herds, 7,000 warriors and 16 Khans, as well as releasing the Christians that the Polovtsi had previously captured. Despite this, Konchak was still at large with more troops. They crossed the Horol River into Rus territory, avoided the Sula, which had a line of fortifications. Rus forces led by Svyatoslav and Rurik found them there and were once again victorious. But elsewhere they were less successful. Igor Svyatoslavich and the minor Olgovichi knyazes were soundly defeated at the Kyala River. Svyatoslav summoned reinforcements, but his brother Yaroslav decided not to come, and David Rostislavich could not persuade his troops to do anything other than defend the city of Kyiv itself. Fortunately for the Rus, the Polovtsi were equally divided. Konchak wanted to attack Kyiv, but his ally, Kozar, wanted to pillage the Olgovichi lands. As they couldn't agree, they split their forces. Kozar left to pillage the countryside without causing any long-term damage, and Konchak was left without sufficient strength to strike at Kyiv. He made a brief and unsuccessful attempt on Pereyaslavl, but then had to withdraw, pillaging as he went. In 1187, the Polovtsi returned, raiding the Ros River and Chernihiv lands. Svyatoslav, Rurik, and Vladimir Glebovich took their men out to face them. The Polovtsi crossed the Dnieper, and the Rus were unable to follow due to rising floodwaters. Vladimir Glebovich fell ill and died. Three years into the conflict with the Polovtsi, Rurik was increasingly anxious for a resolution. As he had taken control of all the Kyiv lands, his domain faced the brunt of the attacks. He demanded more action from Svyatoslav as the senior knyaz to force the other knyazes to play their part in the defense. But Svyatoslav was unable to persuade his brother to bring the Chernihiv troops and got cold feet over continuing without them. According to the chroniclers, this led to a serious argument between the Olgovichi and the Rostislavichi, and between Rurik and Svyatoslav personally, and the campaign had to be abandoned. Perhaps as a result of this, Rurik moved to strengthen his alliances through marriages. Vsevolod's daughter, Svyatoslava, just 8 years old, was brought from Susdalia to marry his son, Rostislav, in Belgorod. In the same week, he married his daughter, Yaroslava, to Svyatoslav Igorovich of Novgorod-Siversky to boost his connections with the Olgovichi. According to the chroniclers, Svyatoslav and Rurik had another fight over the succession to Halych, where Yaroslav Osmomysil, who seems to have been popping up in our story forever, had finally died. We'll catch up on Halych in the next episode as it gets a bit convoluted. The disputed succession drew in the Olgovichi, Vsevolod, the Rostislavichi, the Hungarians and the Poles, and the crux of the falling out was Svyatoslav breaching their agreement against separate agreements. In 1190, the Rus finally managed to compel the Polovtsi to agree a peace. But within a few months, Svyatoslav spoiled everything again. Some of the Chorny Klobuki complained falsely to him about a rival among the allied Polovtsi, Khan Kunt-of-Dey, and Svyatoslav seized him. Kunt-of-Dey was not one of the wild Polovtsi, he was a vassal of Rurik, who intervened to defend his man. He persuaded Svyatoslav that Kunt-of-Dey was innocent and should be released, and Svyatoslav agreed to release him. But Kunt-of-Dey was in no mood for forgiveness, and he raised the Polovtsi for revenge. This was not really thinking things through, since the Chorny Klobuki who had slandered him were also Rurik's vassals, and therefore his raids were harming the man who stood by him rather than Svyatoslav. Rurik asked Svyatoslav to help with pacifying the situation, and Svyatoslav said he would send his son Gleb to assist, but he didn't, undermining their relationship again. The same year, another dispute arose, this time between Svyatoslav and Rurik David and Smolensk. The chroniclers once again decided not to tell us what the dispute was, but only that Svyatoslav thought it was important enough to summon all of the Olgovichi to help him find a way out without violating his oath to the Rostislavichi. The likelihood is that the dispute related to the Rostislavichi controlling the Kyiv land. Svyatoslav would naturally have had an interest in recovering those lands to the control of the Knyaz of Kyiv, while the Rostislavichi would have had an equally strong interest in keeping them and thereby ensuring their succession. As you'll recall, the Rostislavichi had been trying to make Belgorod and Vyshgorod patrimonial possessions since Andrei Bogolyubsky had given Kyiv to Roman, but as the chroniclers also skipped the details of Roman's agreements on the Kyiv towns and the successive agreements, we don't know exactly what each side thought the situation was. It seems reasonable to assume that when Rurik defeated Svyatoslav's Polovtsi and forced the settlement on his terms, he made Svyatoslav agree that the towns he and David held were their patrimonial possessions, and that Svyatoslav later came to regret this and attempt to wiggle out of it. Note here that the Rostislavich's attempt to make their holdings in the Kyiv lands patrimonial went against all Rus tradition, which was that Kyiv and the Kyiv lands were to never become the patrimony of any one knyaz and would always be at the disposal of the ruler of Kyiv. At the same time, losing them would mean that Svyatoslav would need to compensate Rurik and David for their towns, and they would in turn need to compensate their followers for their losses. If Svyatoslav could steer his way through this, the power sharing would end and he would be the sole ruler. In the end, the challenge failed. The chroniclers once again do not bother to give us the details. They just tell us that Rurik and David, backed by Vsevolod Bignest, forced Svyatoslav to swear a new oath about what they don't say, but we are probably safe to assume that it acknowledged and continued the status quo. By 1192, Svyatoslav and Rurik were friends again, and Kuntub-Day was also back in the fold. Rurik gave him a new appointment on the Ros River, away from the Chorny Klubuki, to avoid repeats of the previous events, and Rurik also reached a peace agreement with the Lukomorci Polovtsi. In 1193, Svyatoslav suggested that they used the agreement with the Lukomorci to bring all of the Polovtsi in, especially one tribe the Rus called the Olgovichi, who Svyatoslav believed were the main culprits behind the raiding of the Kievan lands. However, when the parties gathered to negotiate, Svyatoslav decided that the Olgovichi had treacherous intentions, so he refused to reach an agreement with them, and because he was taking an all-or-nothing approach, he also ended the agreement with the Lukomorci. The Polovtsi thus returned to raiding with the Rus. The Chorny Klubuki wanted to renew their war with the Polovtsi, so they asked Rurik's son Rostislav to lead them. He brought his cousin, Mstislav Mstislavich from Trepol, and they ran a successful punitive campaign into the steppe. Rurik had, in the meantime, been planning a campaign from Smolensk against the Lithuanians, but with war against the Polovtsi back on the menu, Svyatoslav persuaded him to drop those plans and remain in Belgorod to defend the Kyiv lands. In the winter, the two knyazes sent their troops to the southern border to guard against the Polovtsi. After a couple of months of inaction, they went home, and then, of course, the Polovtsi attacked. The approach of spring found Svyatoslav in Karachyov, one of his patrimonial towns in Olgovichi territory. He was considering a campaign against Ryazan, who he was accusing of taking some Olgovichi land, but he was having trouble getting this past Vsevolod Bignest, who saw Ryazan as being within his sphere of influence. Forced to abandon his plans due to Vsevolod's opposition, Svyatoslav set out for Kyiv, but fell ill along the way and died, ending a career of limited achievement. The death of Svyatoslav leaves Vsevolod and Rurik as rivals, without a third player to balance them out. The period of relative stability in Rus is ending. Now comes a slow slide into a century of chaos. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.